Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this important live session. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're here on a very special occasion as Nigeria celebrates her 65th year of independence. And on this special occasion, we are reminded of the aspirations that defined 1960: unity, prosperity, and a future of dignity for every Nigerian. And so the theme of our discussion is very timely. Today, we're going to be speaking about the reform imperative, building a prosperous and inclusive Nigeria by 2030. This session provides a platform not just to reflect on 1960 and the independence and all the years that have gone by, but it's an opportunity to ask the hard questions about what it will take to finally fulfill the promise of independence. And over the years, while there are many achievements worth noting, some of which we will discuss today, there are some setbacks that are extremely sobering. And so the question before us today is very urgent. What bold reforms, whether economic, social, institutional, will chart Nigeria's next step to prosperity? How will we achieve our next big leap? What specific actions between now and 2030 can we take to move millions out of poverty, to unlock jobs, and to build resilience for our country? And most importantly, citizens, the government, the private sector, the institutions, how can we all come together to drive and sustain these reforms? This is the conversation that we're here to have today. And I have a fantastic set of panelists that would help take us into this conversation and break down some of these things. I'm going to say the panelists, I'm going to tell you a little bit about them so you know exactly who you're listening to. And then we're going to dive into the conversation. First of all, we have Dr. Gbenga Shadare, who is a senior lecturer, Canterbury Christ Church University and Buckinghamshire New University. Dr. Shadare holds a PhD in sociology and social policy from the University of Sheffield, United Kingdom. He is also an alumnus of Nottingham, Ibadan, and Lagos universities. For over 2 decades, Dr. Shadare worked as a banker, financial analyst, telecommunications analyst, and successfully launched 3 successful businesses in Nigeria. These are the Investment Alliance Limited, the Watermark WA Limited, and the Anti-Fraud Foundation. Dr. Shadare is an alumnus of the Lagos Business School, Pan Atlantic University, and has worked in international development across several African and Asian countries where his expertise revolved around the implementation of social protection / social investment systems and programs. Welcome, Dr. Shadare.
Thank
Next
you.
up, we have Dr. Zuhuman Dapel, who is a member of the NES 31 Technical Subcommittee. Dr. Dapper was awarded a PhD in economics by the University of Dundee, Scotland, UK. He previously graduated from the University of Jos in Nigeria with a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in economics. His PhD research focused on poverty, mobility, inequality, and oil in Nigeria. Previously, Dr. Dapper has worked as a part-time consultant with the Overseas Development Institute, Policy Associates, African Finance Corporation, PwC, and as an adjunct lecturer at the Nigerian Television Authority TV College Jos, where he taught media and the economy to the fourth-year students of TV journalism. He also taught at the University of Jos for 2 years as a full-time lecturer. He has been a contributing writer for the US Foreign Policy magazine and leading Nigeria national dailies, and has been interviewed for his research by the BBC World Services on poverty in Nigeria. In 2020, he received the British Academy Exceptional Talent Endorsement, and 3 years before this, he won the Scottish Institute for Research in Economics grant and became a public policy fellow at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and an IDRC fellow at the Center for Global Development, Washington, D.C., USA. He had 2 career stints in Canada, one as a visiting scholar at the International Development Research Centre, Ontario, and another as a guest lecturer in economics at the University of Halifax, Nova Scotia. In addition to this, he is also an affiliate of the Center for Energy Ethics at the University of St. Andrews. Very, very warm welcome to you, Dr. Dappel. And then, last but not the least, definitely, is Dr. Faith Iyoha, who is an economist at the NESG. Dr. Iyoha holds a PhD in economics with an interest in macroeconomics, international trade and finance, monetary economics, and public sector economics. Over the last 15 years, area has evolved and revolved around consulting, teaching, and policy advocacy. She's currently a senior associate economist at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, NESG. She's also an adjunct faculty at the Pan Atlantic University and a partner at the Kainos Edge Consulting Limited. Very warm welcome to you, Dr. Iyoha.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for being here. And last but not the least, my name is Shalakwe Shonuga, and I'll be the moderator for today. And we're just going to dive straight into the meat of the matter. And of course, before we start, to everyone listening, please note that if you have any questions at all during the session, we're going to have a specific time for question and answer. So please put in your questions in the comments, and we'll be sure to take as many as possible before the end of the session. And so I'm going to start with you, Dr. Shadare. And I'm very excited about this question because from your years and years of experience and with your perspective as an economist, since independence, what do you think are the reforms that have been truly transformative for Nigeria? There have been so many reforms that have been, very spectacular, especially in the telecommunication system and in the banking industry. Some of those that we all know very well. But from your own perspective, what do you think have been the truly transformative reforms, and what key lessons should these reforms help us to guide to the next phase of reform as we, drive the path towards 2030?
Okay, thank you. First of all, let me appreciate the summit for the invitation, and also to welcome my fellow panelists and those who are listening from across the globe on different platforms. So you've asked a very good question at transformative reform, and I think it's very important to start, from a very helpful standpoint. Maybe we could, well, for instance, I would like to unpack or define what a transformative reform is. What does it mean? When we talk about transformative, just for the benefit of everyone listening, and I'm sure some of my panelists will probably agree with me. We could disagree, but that's welcome. A transformative reform is a type of reform that fundamentally alters the structure of any economy, whether it's in terms of policies, or whether in terms of institutions, or whether in terms of the structures, And usually the aims of any transformative reform is a number of things. Number one, maybe to improve economic efficiency, when you bring implementation, enhancing and promoting competition, and liberalizing, creating room for innovation, and improving productivity, or deconstructing, or what's it, unleashing productivity. Let me use that word. The other thing about is also to improve or increase equity. By that I mean reducing income inequality, which is important, and also promoting, alongside that, social justice. Then the third thing that a transformative reform does is to fundamentally overhaul the institution, the market mechanism, the regulatory frameworks, and maybe even kickstart or introduce some new agencies that can help to deliver the agenda of the reform. So when we talk about, so as an economist, putting on my economic lens now, so a transformative reform is a system, is a plan of policy, set of policy package that alters the structure of any economy. But I would say they can do so by changing a number of things. Number one, incentive systems. the rewards and maybe even the punishment, for large segments of actors in the economy. But again, it leads to or would also create new pathways, for growth and productivity. So if we look at all of that, if you look at all of those metrics, all of those measures, actually very few reforms will qualify. Okay. But those that do, they are very monumental. So I'm going to just, with respect to Nigeria, I think I'm going to try and identify a couple of reforms, in post-independence Nigeria that I think will meet to some degree, some of those metrics. Number one, I'm going to start with the structural adjustment program in 1986, which was introduced by Babangida administration. A lot of people have called it all kinds of names, and to be honest with you, it's a very consequential economic reform in Nigerian post-independent history. And the reason why it's because its outcomes were very mixed, and even we're still debating, we're still debating a lot of the impact that it's had. But I think for me, what stands out about SAP or Structural Adjustment Program is that some of these transformative impacts have been undeniable. I'll mention it too. So what was transformative about Structural Adjustment Program? The first thing about it, which I think was fundamental when you think about it, was that it shifted the Nigerian economy from a controlled economy to a market economy. And it did that by dismantling the import licensing system, got rid of it, it abolished the commodity marketing boards, and then started a process of privatization and commercialization of public enterprises. So that in itself moved Nigeria away from what you might call a state-centric protectionist model towards a market-driven one. That was fundamental. The other thing that SAP did, you could argue, you could debate the disadvantages, the impact, of course, the negative impact, and whether SAP actually met or achieved its outcomes or its goals. The other thing that it did actually was that it unbundled the financial system by introducing what was then called as FEM, because I was also a player. I was in the banking sector at that time. I remember the second tier foreign exchange market. I can see Dr. Yoya nodding her head. And that in itself, that move was one of the first radical major attempts to break Nigeria from a fixed, overvalued naira. So SPEM basically just devalued the Nigerian currency to reflect market realities and also to boost non-oil exports, and then actually curb our import dependence. That move, I believe, set a precedence for subsequent forex management, innovations or even debates and discourses. Okay. The third thing that I think, which I've touched on it a little bit, the third thing that I think that this structural adjustment program did was to dismantle the marketing boards at the state level. So if you think about it, that move, the marketing boards were acting more like monostonist, a board where they were in control. They had monopoly over buying, commodities from farmers, and agricultural commodities. So, and by dissolving the marketing boards, the farmers across Nigeria were empowered, and they were now able to sell their goods, their commodities at market prices. So, but when we think about structural adjustment program, we have to think about its failures as well as its successes. So, they did achieve the promised diversification? I don't think so. Did he actually, uplift Nigerian economic industrial capacity? I think no, because when you think about the influx of imports, that actually did not. I don't think that happened. But again, the major disadvantage of structural adjustment was the fact that there were no social safety nets. So the social cost of implementing that policy was very, very heavy and immense. But I think when we think about But regardless of how we feel or on which side of the debate that we fall into, I think what we can agree on is that the structural adjustment program irrevocably, without any doubt, changed the conversation in Nigerian politics, in Nigerian political environment or political economy, about the role of the state versus market. I can go on. I can mention the other one, like in 2004, we had the banking consolidation exercise, which I think was was another, transformative policy. Many of us will remember that. So, but I will stop there, and we can talk about it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shadare. I know that there'll be another opportunity later for us to go, into more of those reforms from the past. But I do take away quite a lot from what you said already. Opening up the market was very instrumental in the SAP, but the social safety nets weren't put in place, and that's perhaps a huge lesson that we need to take forward in some of the policies that we are proposing in our journey towards 2030. And to take up the conversation from here, I'm going to go to you, Dr. Dappel. You're an economist that has many years of experience. And so from your own perspective and standpoint, do you think that the promise of independence has been fulfilled for the average Nigerian? Because it's one thing, having those big policies, but it's another thing as how it affects the regular person on the street or the average Nigerian. So, how do you think it has affected the average Nigerian? Do you think that that promise has been fulfilled? And then, how should we approach the next phase of reforms based on this perspective that you have?
Thank you to everybody joining us, and for NESG for organizing this, and for you too for moderating it. Now, if I say it has fulfilled the promises and I'm somewhere in Nigeria, I will get stoned because there is growing economic discontent after 65 years. Now, during independence, the Prime Minister made a statement at the time, Tafawa Balewa, and I quote him. He said, "Bitterness due to political differences would carry Nigeria nowhere. I appeal to the political leaders throughout the country to control their party extremists." End of quote. Now, it's like he foresaw these things that are happening, and they are the root of some of the problems we're facing, because ethnic fractionalization is one of the biggest impediments to economic progress. And he was trying to address this problem from day one of Nigeria as a country. He wished that there would be a country that there would be no bitterness due to political differences. You hold to ideology, you hold to a belief, but we shouldn't allow these things to shape the way we build our nation. We have to have a common ground. We have to have an enabling ground, because the economic outcomes is going to benefit everybody, regardless of your ethnicity or religion. So I wouldn't say we've achieved, but there was a time in the history of Nigeria that we experienced the golden age. And that's the period of remarkable economic success. The livelihood of many Nigerians was booming. And we had great universities staffed by top academics. Lecturers were well looked after. Students were well looked after. There was almost zero unemployment at the time. I'm referring to those finishing universities. Job was available for everybody that was coming out of the uni. And Nigeria was not a borrowing nation at the time, and there was more than enough. That golden age, roughly the decade of the 1960s the decade of the 1970s, that was a period of that golden age, and it coincided with when there was expansion in Nigeria's oil output and increase in oil price. So you combine this, you have massive revenue coming in for the government. And at the time, the government spent these monies on the people. In fact, the corruption level at that time was far lower than what we have now, because of that, most of the proceeds from oil was benefiting the people rather than the few leaders in power who were in charge of these revenues coming in. And you could say that the leadership at the time had more love for the country, more love for the people than they do for money and power. So we've lost that golden age going into the decades that begin from 1980s. And since then, we tried to have a little bit of a recovery when democracy returned in 1999, but that was not sustainable. So a lot of things happened that it will take us a lot of time to discuss the journey to the current economic situation. But the promise of independence is still pending, and I hope we see it in our lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dapo. You've made me a little bit emotional, actually, just listening to you speak about some of the gaps between independence and now. And I wish I was alive to experience some of these things. But I'm happy that we have scholars like you to take us back and help us reflect on some of the things, some of the place that we're coming from, and how we've allowed some issues to perhaps lead us to where we are today. And it's very interesting because it takes me to my next question directed at Dr. Iyoha, because at Independence, the data indicates that over 60% or about 60% of our GDP was brought in by agriculture. But today, it's a very big disparity from how it was before. And with the oil boom and then, a lot of the things that have come and gone and the internet age, a lot of things, affect our economics as a nation and our GDP and the things that bring in money for us. And so, Dr. Yu, I want to ask you, what parallels do you think that we can draw between 1960 and 2025? There's so many changes, so many differences that have come with the 21st century. But also, in addition to the parallels, what lessons do you think we can learn that have shaped our reform journey as a nation?
Thank you very much for that question. So let's talk about what happened in 1960 and how it correlates with what we have in 2025. So in terms of the parallel, we can say both years mark a turning point for our nation. And during this period, what we saw in 1960 is still what is being reflected now. We were endowed with natural and human resources. So in the 1960s, the major turning point was marked by political freedom, while we were endowed with natural resources, oil, and also human resources. In 2025, we see these resources still available to Nigeria. We see a point where we have an expectation, a futuristic expectation. And it was also the same expectation that drove the political freedom. In 2025, it's marked with a demographic transition and also a technological turning point. Then and now, so when I say then and now, 1960 and 2025, Nigerian future depends on leadership and resource management. Essentially, how leaders can convert endowment in terms of natural resources, human resources, and even some level of freedom that we got to translate such resources into productive. Essentially, when we talk about the lessons, what we did then and what we should avoid now is limited investment in, and we start investing. We have the statistics that Nigeria, we have a large population by 2030, 80 years as the medium age, it's in early enough. It is all important. Hello, can you hear me, Sholakbe?
You're glitching a little bit, and I was trying to figure out if it was from my end or your end, but I think it's from your end.
Okay.
But I did catch most of what you said, though.
Okay, so in terms of lessons, I was saying we should invest early in human capital. It is important to also design institutions that outlives political and administrative cycles or transition. It is also important to align our macro stability or our macro conditions with industrial strategy. It is important to also focus on credible sequencing of reforms rather than just quick fix or ad hoc fix. We want to quickly do something because the political election is coming so that we can win and things like that. No, such reforms or such strategy should transcend the person. It should go beyond the now. It should look more into the future. And those are some of the lessons that we should start drawing from what happened since 1960 till now. Essentially, this is not the time to be sentimental about the past, but it's the time to stand up and do something that will take us into the prosperous and inclusive Nigeria that we think of. Now, practically, what are the things that I think that we can do to drive inclusiveness and prosperity going forward? So one of the things I think we should look at is to start unlocking those constraints that limited our capacity to use our natural endowment, in a way that it becomes productive capital for us. It is important to also prioritize policies that create a long-lasting comparative and competitive advantage in sectors like agro-processing, manufacturing, digital economy. It is important to start pairing investment that drives innovation across sectors and make sure that sectors' growth are broad-based. It is important, and lastly, it is important to strengthen institutions and then plug leakages in public finance and public management. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyoha. If you notice, as you were speaking, I was just writing vigorously so that I don't miss any of the key points. You've raised so many important things, and I've learned a lot. The importance of investing in our human capital and unlocking institutions that would also help us to invest in our natural resources. Those are very, very important things that we need to learn. Those are the lessons that we need to take forward. And you even started alluding to my next question before I even asked it. That's how I know that we're in sync, because you were speaking about some of the industries that we need to plug into and industries that we need to invest in. And from even basic, the first economics class that I took, I remember we talked about scale of preference and making sure that you have to prioritize a few things over the other to ensure that your resources, the limited resources that you have, can be okay for you to, do the things that you need to do. And so there's so many sectors in Nigeria that are very important. You look at education, the power sector, job creation, entrepreneurship, agriculture, agro-processing, you mentioned, food security, inclusion, equity, and all those other sectors within the country. There's so many of them. And so from your perspective, what sectors would you think require the most urgent reforms in Nigeria if we are to achieve prosperity by 2030? Which ones should we look at? Which ones should we invest in? I know that we should invest in all of them, but looking at scale of preference, which ones should we prioritize the most?
Okay, thank you, Sholakbe. So as we drive towards achieving prosperity and inclusion in 2030 or by 2030, so I think one of the things we should start doing, the first sector, I think for me is a priority, should be to unlock the binding constraints to power, energy, and infrastructure. Power, energy, and infrastructure. Now, why did I bring this as first? If you are to drive inclusion, inclusion is about access and availability. Now, it has to be available first, then we can now create access. So if you have access and it's not available, then there's no way inclusion can happen. So to create that access, we must first unlock the power sector and the infrastructure sector to drive industrialization and to drive economic competitiveness. Now, reliable energy and logistics, they are non-negotiable when we talk about industrialization. We must reform our power sector and our infrastructure. Specifically, when you take a look at the statistics, the energy need per person for a year is about 3,200 kilowatts hour per person annually. And with a population of almost 220 million, if not more, it means we need about 80,000 megawatts per annum. Essentially, what are we doing? We are doing just between 4,000 and 5,000 megawatts per annum. That is less than 7% of the required energy per person or electricity per person. So you see, we have a long way to go in terms of unlocking the binding constraints to drive industrialization. The next, because you are driving industrialization, then there will be productivity. Then we need to create the access to enable people to be included in the prosperity that we are trying to create. And to do that, we must start investing in our human capital. We must develop our human capital in terms of education and health. We must revamp our curriculum to focus on developing skills. We must also revamp our technical, vocational studies or system so that we can give people access to this job, because you can't have 2 million people, 200 million people, out of which about 80% should be part of the labor force. And then this labor force, because of skills, cannot be part of the formal sector where they can get decent income. So the next sector, I think, having created the availability and then the access, then we should unlock the binding constraint to agro and agro processing. We should move from just commodity export to value add processing. We should fixing infrastructure will give us some leverage here as well. It will improve our competitiveness. Then we can talk about our manufacturing and industrial policy. Now, what is manufacturing doing? Less than 5% of GDP. Now we need to take that up so that we can create the necessary or the needed decent job to drive inclusion. If we do not do this, if we do not unlock these constraints or develop these sectors, what will happen is that our natural resources or human capital dividends, rather than being a dividend, might become a cost in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyoha. I feel like you've been able to say so much in the time that you've been given. And the three major sectors that you mentioned. You first of all spoke about power, energy, and infrastructure. Very, very important. And then, of course, the next is human capital development, so that they can tap into those sectors. And then the last but not the least is agro and agro processing. So I can see that the three things that you mentioned are all very, very interconnected and very, very key points. I absolutely agree with everything that you said, and I hope that we really do tap into these sectors to take Nigeria to the next level by 2030. And going to the next question, I'm going to go to you, Dr. Shadare. there have been a lot of policies, even in the sectors that Dr. EU have mentioned. In manufacturing, there have been policies. In power, there have been so many policies. So in your own perspective, and even over the years from 1960 up to now, I know that you were speaking about the SAP, and you also spoke a little bit about the banking industry. A lot of reforms have been introduced, but we don't necessarily see the results of those reforms. The National Bureau of Statistics reports that over 133 million Nigerians live in multidimensional poverty, which means that they lack access to finance, healthcare, and education. And so the measure of our success isn't just the reforms that have been introduced, but how it impacts and it shapes the lives of Nigerians. And so from your own perspective, how do you think that some of these reforms can translate into real improvement in the lives of people? So real improvement in jobs, in infrastructure, in the standard of living of people. How can our reforms actually touch the lives of Nigerians? You're muted, Dr. Shadare.
Sorry. So I think that should be the central question that should concern all of us here as panelists and every Nigerian that is listening to this. I hope some of our policymakers are listening, because because for me, the issue is not so much the fact that we do not have reforms. I think the problem has been that, at least from the perspective of the average Nigerian, the problem has been that the reform tends to be elegantly packaged on white paper with little or no meaningful, tangible impact on the lives of average Nigerian, on the ordinary Nigerian on the street. Because the ordinary Nigerian on the street is not interested in the eloquence or the sophistry or how beautiful or how elegantly packaged those reforms agenda are. They are interested in simple questions. Can I find a good job? Do I have electricity? Can I afford food and shelter? So the problem, I think the thing we need to address is to how come up with a structural way of how we can deal with the gap, the persistent gap that has influenced, that has shaped, that has affected every reform from the time Nigeria became independent. So how do we then, close that gap between intentions and the lived reality? Because so we need to, and I think that what is happening here is also a failure of what I call transmission mechanisms. So what that means is that to bridge all the gaps, the gap between intention, because most of the policies are, I think I can name at the top of my hands that are, in post-independence Nigeria, that I think have come close to being transformative. They are well intended, they are well intentioned rather, but to engineer reforms that are with explicit built-in pathways to deliver meaningful results and outcomes for people, we need to focus on breaking them down so that it could make sense to the average Nigerian. So I will look at maybe three pillars. Let me start with job creation. So reforms by their own, let me just quickly say this. Reforms do not create jobs directly. I think that is a misnomer. A lot of people, there's a myth. At the moment people hear reforms, there's going to be jobs. But what they do, by the very nature of reforms, what reforms does is that they create the conditions for job to be created. They create conditions for businesses to thrive, and expand. So it is be a wrong way, to think that you can come up with an ease of doing business metric or plan or formula, and that just by simplifying, for instance, business registration and making it easy, dismantling the barriers, that will be okay. No, it is not. It is insufficient. So Because a young graduate, you said something, Sholakwe, that you were getting emotional when Dr. Dappel talked about some things. A young graduate in Nigeria today is not interested in a simplified certificate of incorporation. What they are interested in are targeted sector-specific reforms that can change their lives. So we need power. I agree with Dr. Yoha. We need power reform, because power reform is a job multiplier. A successful reform that will create and ensure stable, affordable electricity is one of the single biggest policy that needs to be enacted. I mean, if our leaders really, really want to transform Nigeria, that will be the first thing, because doing that, it's a force multiplier. Power reform is a force multiplier in that it allows, for instance, the small manufacturer in Inewi to run a night shift and then hire more people, maybe 30. It allows the cold storage owner in Zaria, for instance, to preserve more goods, expanding their businesses and then hiring more staff. So you can see how it can multiply. It has multiplier effect on different aspects. And or the tech startup in Lagos, in Yaba, to stop spending, it will help them to stop spending 60% of their income on their capital, on diesel or fuel. And then they can also hire more developers instead. So the lesson there, the point here is that, and I think the crucial point is that, in order to be bold on the power reform, it has to be framed not as an energy sector issue. I think that has been the problem. We should not frame it as an energy sector issue. We should actually frame it as an industrial and employment policy issue, because then that framing allows us to have a sort of holistic, idea of the scale and the potentials of unleashing, massive economic growth. So again, going back to Dr. Yoa, she talked about agro-processing and agriculture. No, yeah, of course, we still have a lot of bottlenecks that needs to be dismantled in the agricultural sector, so that the value chain can be, open up. The space can be opened up for massive, unleashing and creation of inclusive employment. Because actually, that is one of our core strengths. We talked about competitive advantage. Nigeria has one of the richest, agricultural, lands for farming, and you will not believe. We've seen it. We've seen, instances where South African farmers, when some of them were asked to leave, South Africa, or in Zimbabwe when Robert Mugabe was pursuing a nationalistic agenda, some of them relocated to Nigeria, and they found their base and they were doing well. So we need to restructure the agro processing and agricultural sector. We need to create farms. We need to unbundle, that sector, because that sector is actually waiting. And to do that, there are some things we can do. Land reform. Farmers need to be able to have ownership, concrete, serious ownership of the land, so that they can use it, for instance, as collateral to access credit and to expire their businesses and even employ more people. We need logistics and storage reform. The road that Dr. Yoa talked about. We need to have like a kind of a Marshall Plan, a Marshall Plan that will incorporate not just the power sector reform, but a Marshall Plan that will also be focused on massive infrastructural uplift and upgrade. The road transport system, the sector, trains, and also investment in cold chain, that can reduce post-harvest losses, because that's one of the huge problems. Losses in post-harvest losses are huge. And this, if we can focus on those ones, we will not only be unleashing productivity, but actually will be incentivizing farmers to help them to create more jobs, and more jobs will be created, for instance, in logistics, in warehousing, in processing. So how do we move from subsistence farming, which is actually the bane? We can move from subsistence farming by focusing on this commercial agro-processing, reform that can help us to create jobs, and not just in the farm, but also in factories, in packaging and marketing. And there are other things that we can do, like on the infrastructural front. But I will
Yeah.
stop there. Yeah, I'm going to stop there so that I can allow others, because I'm reading some of the comments, some people online as well. So,
Yes. Um, thank you so much, Dr. Shadare. You've said quite a lot, and you've given a very rich submission on how we can drive reforms. And I'm happy that you actually spoke about people online. This is my appeal to everyone online to please pop in your questions on the group chat, or in the comments, not the group chat, in the comments. Immediately after this whole dialogue, we're going to open up the floor to answer questions. So if you have any questions, if you have anything that is burning on your mind, please put it in the comments wherever you're watching, and we will make sure that we take as many questions as possible. And so back to you, Dr. Shadare, on all the amazing things that you said. And one of the things that really stuck to me is the sector specific reforms that then translate into job creation and reforms in other sectors, and packaging it as such. And so power would, affect infrastructure and could eventually even affect agro producing and agriculture and all of that. And so being careful to coin those reforms and ensuring that the sectors that we are focusing on in reforms have the capacity and the power to transform other sectors as well, so that we can have holistic and wholesome improvements. So thank you so much, Dr. Shadare, for that submission. And my next question is actually closely linked with a lot of the things that you've said, because you've given very, very brilliant suggestions about some of these reforms, and some of the things that should be prioritized. And so I'm going to come to you, Dr. Dappel. While these are very, very fantastic submissions, the truth is that in Nigeria, no matter how many reforms that we propose, we have to, or we understand that there are some systemic barriers that hold us back. And that would also determine whether a lot of these reforms are successful or not. Some of these systemic barriers have been there since 1960, and some of them are also a bit recent, given the oil boom and COVID-19 and a lot of the things that have happened in recent times. And so what do you think, from your own perspective, are some of these systemic barriers that are holding us back as a country, so that we can identify them and start planning towards addressing them?
Well, yeah, there are quite a lot, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. So, one of it is one of the reasons behind reforms not generating the required outcomes is the trade-off between corruption and market failure. Another two is, I've mentioned it earlier, ethnic fractionalization, and possible one two is political mistrust, and the fourth one I can think of is we take economic policies that are not grounded in enough evidence. And so a combination of a lot of these things, they stall reforms and they end up generating worse outcome prior to their, compared to before their launch. So when you talk of the choice between corruption and market failure, theoretically, when an economic system is out of balance, or technical word for that is disequilibrium, you would say, okay, the government should not play much role in trying to restore it, let the system restore itself. So these are like the classical schools of economics. So they believe in the power of the free market. The economy can adjust itself and return to where it should be. Like we had COVID shocks, we have a lot of recession, depression, and financial crisis. The government should not do a lot. The government should just allow the system to fix itself. But judging from history, we've seen that economies around the world have failed to adjust when they are hit by shocks like financial crisis. And then you have to have the government step in and correct these market failures. So how is the government correcting these market failures? The government would set up institutions, set up agencies, and staff these agencies with bureaucrats. So these agencies, they are supposed to craft and implement government policies to help correct the failures of this market. Now that has created an avenue between government represented by bureaucrats and also business people. And as a result, you see that the institutions that are supposed to serve as oversight function to represent public interests, once they cozy up to business leaders, they tend to rig the rules in favor of business leaders. And so most of the policies ended up benefiting the super rich to make more profit at their own expense. So the ideal theory of capitalism by the intellectual godfather of the subject, Adam Smith, was that he believed everybody would do the right thing, that invincible hand would get things corrected, that business people pay their fair share in taxes, they will not bribe lawmakers to cut corners and get some special licensing favors and all of this and that. That was his own idea. And then he said, okay, let's go with that. But we see down the line in Nigeria, there is a very strong symbiotic relationship between the government agencies and business people, and that profit maximization of companies is not helping improve the welfare of the citizens. So it's supposed to be like a win-win situation. Companies are generating a lot of money. Banks are declaring billions in profits. We should also see that's reflecting in the lives of the people, because how do you make profit? Production, you employ people, they earn income in the process. But when you are amassing a lot of wealth without a direct link to economic activity, that's rent seeking and it's destroying the system. So that's one of the problems. So we try to find a balance between market failure and corruption. That's the trade-off. And one of the things too is political mistrust. So one government comes into power and finds the policy on the ground. They have this notion that this policy is designed to favor some certain people and is not in national interest in their own definition. And as a result, they just destroy this policy. So let me give you one example. Some years back, there was this subsidiary investment program called SHOP. And part of that money, I think it was $134 million or $34 million at the time. They apportioned that money and say, okay, if you give money to promising people, can you get better outcome out of it? So they do like conditional cash transfers. They ask you to submit proposals. They pull in thousands of applicants to do competition. If your proposal wins, you get the grant. You hit the ground running with business. Now, David McKenzie, he was the lead economist at the World Bank at the time. He did impact assessment of this You Win program, and it was a massive positive outcome. Even with the electricity constraint, energy constraint, it was a massive success. There were lots of job increases, because you do conditional cash transfers. You give cash to people that have satisfied certain conditions. In this case, these are people that have graduated from universities. They have business ideas, but they lack the capital to power these ideas. And so the government steps in and dismantle that constraint by transferring cash to them. And there was massive positive ripple effect. And then the governments that follow after, they just destroy these policies and just say, okay, we're dumping this. We don't believe it's for the good of Nigeria. So lots of examples we can talk about, but corruption, we must mention it, is one of the reasons. Then the last one, before I close on this question, I mentioned that a lot of policies are not grounded in enough evidence. For instance, in America, they have what is called a Council of Economic Advisors. It's been in existence for over 70 years. It's made up of permanent statisticians, like few of them, and then you have 22 economists, academic economists, lots of them Nobel laureates. Their job is to advise the president if he wants taking decisions on the economy. So if you want, for instance, the president say he wants to lower interest rate, he's going to approach them and say, what do you think? I want to remove subsidy. What do you think? They're not going to respond to him based on their ideology, political leanings, or feelings. They would respond to him based on what the evidence is saying from the data they've analyzed. So one example was when President Obama appointed one of the top labor economists in the world to be his chief economic advisor, Alan Kruger. And he was to advise him on whether to raise minimum wage or not. And Alan Kruger told him, you can't just raise minimum wage because you want to help the working people. You have to look at that when you raise minimum wage, you can create job losses because you've made labor much more expensive. But there's a threshold, you can raise it, but there's a threshold above which you start generating job losses. So they were well grounded in evidence and they were leading the charge. And that's not what really we're seeing playing out. And so lots of policies, they have been failing and they are being attacked most of the time by political interests.
Wow. Thank you so much for your contribution, Dr. Dapo. You've said quite a lot, and this is now a sobering moment because we've talked about all the hurdles that we are going to need to jump to get to the prosperous future that we want to see by 2030. Things like corruption, the introduction of more evidence-based policy and more economics-backed policy, the problem of ethnic fractionalization, and the disconnect between policy and bureaucracy and the government, amongst many others. And so while we reflect on some of those barriers and start to think about how we're going to overcome them, I'm going to go to you, Dr. Iyoha, and I hope I'm not putting you in a tough spot after talking about some of the barriers. But now that we've identified some of the reforms that we can take, and then we've identified some of the barriers that we face, the next thing is ensuring that reforms and policies don't just look good on paper. So how do we jump through these hurdles? How do we go over the barriers? And how do we make sure that a lot of these fantastic reforms that we've proposed, that we know that the government might even take on, how do we make sure that they are implemented? How do we cross the gap between proposal of policies and actually implementing these policies so that the citizens like myself can benefit from them?
All right, thank you very much, Shalakbe. So, in terms of transitioning from just paper to implementation, there are a lot of things that should be done, even on paper, documentation. So, implementation requires, first, your ability to measure correctly what the reform is going to be and what are the established KPIs, key performance indicators or milestone. It must be well articulated and timed. And essentially, one point to note is that such reforms, they are not just supposed to be quick wins or quick fix. They should transcend administration. It should be enshrined within an agency or an institution that would drive the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation over time, over the period of time that the reforms is going to run. Then you cannot just start reforms without, first of all, counting the cost and then getting buy-in. So it means reforms must be co-created. There must be a collaborative effort to define this and to define and establish these KPIs or measures. So it means you need to bring in the private sector, you need to bring in the public sector, you need to bring in the citizens, because in so doing, you understand those that are for and those that are against, and you understand the reason why. So you have a broad-based perspective about the reform, not just you sitting in one corner and just trying to put something on paper without understanding the different perspective around what you're going to do. When you understand the different perspectives, that will help you to know whether the reforms should be one-off or should be gradually done. Now, in the case of the subsidy removal, it was almost one-off. I said, oh, let's take it off. The reason that happened was because they did not understand the nuances within that framework. They did not understand the implication and how people will feel the pains then. That is why collaboration is important, co-creating it, understanding the pains, because when you enact a reforms, there will be gainers and losers. And then what you need to do is to create a buffer to say, okay, what are the safety nets? What are the precautions for those that are going to feel the pain or carry the burden of these reforms? For the vulnerable, it may be individual, it may be businesses. How do you assist them to bear the burden of reforms? It is a sort of compensation. So ahead of you enacting these reforms, you must have this in place. And this is only possible when it is co-created and you understand a different perspective around the reforms. Then reforms should be sequenced. Remember, we have said that there are several sectors which must be reformed to make sure that we achieve inclusion by 2030. Then how do we make sure that we are not just doing everything at the same time? What is our priority? So, like I mentioned, priority should be what? Unlock the binding constraint in power, because that will go a long way in driving competitiveness and industrialization. So it must be sequenced. You must start with, sometimes you may even need to start with a pilot project rather than let me just do everything. You must start with, oh, can we do it gradually? Can we test it to see, oh, what the reaction or what the impact could be? And then you must find a way to start with a slow paced or a gradual process to see the impact. Then in terms of capacity, we need to develop capacity to implement reforms. There's always a gap between the planning and the implementation. So there is need to now develop capacity to implement, and not just implementing, to evaluate over time and to monitor the process to say, oh, we are deviating from what our target is, and then this is the next step to take to bring us back on track. Then we must also make sure that it is clearly communicated. It is clearly communicated. And in communication, you drive transparency and you even get buy-in. So get a clear communication of the reforms. Let everyone that needs to know about it know, everyone that needs to hear about it hear. And then you're able to drive accountability. Then when you clearly communicate and people are asking you to come and show, you should be able to show what you've done. And then there must be a kind of institution that allows people freedom of speech and the rule of law, so that when people are asking you, you don't start getting infuriated or saying, why should you start requesting for accountability? Some of the things that we've seen in recent times are some of the comments that have been made without public statistics or data to back this assertion. It becomes difficult because the government, they are in charge of the data, which can either support the narrative or discredit a narrative. And when they don't release it, it becomes difficult to start accepting some of the facts or the position they are taking. So there is need for transparency, and then there is need to release information. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyoha. I think that these are very salient points, and now my mind is not even on the barriers, on the systemic barriers anymore. We're now focusing on ensuring that we are institutionalizing these things, so not just quick wins, and we are co-creating and we're sequencing and we're communicating these things, and we're ensuring accountability. And I'm sure that if we follow these clearly laid out steps that you have introduced to us, I think that we'll be able to see those gains by 2030. My next question is to Dr. Dappel. before we go into the Q&A. I actually had a question for Dr. Shadare, but somebody in the Q&A has already asked that question, so I will take that question when it's time for the questions and answers. But then my next question would then go to Dr. Dappel. And before I ask that question, I will just encourage everybody again in the audience that if you're listening and you have any questions or you require any clarification on anything that has been said, please don't be shy. Put your questions in the comments and we'll make sure that we try and take them before we finish up the session. And so, Dr. Dappel, over to you. I'm just going to ask you that we know that the 31st Nigerian Economic Summit is coming up very soon, in just a few days, actually. And so, as a member of the technical subcommittee of this summit, what should we be expecting from the summit that is coming up? I know that it's going to be very exciting. It's going to be very packed. I know that conversations like this would continue to go on. But what is it that we should be expecting from the summit?
Yeah, just like you said, it will be a very exciting one, much more than the conversation we're having now, because of the caliber of people that would be present and will be speaking. So if you are moving a nation forward, you need political power, you need economic power, and you also need the knowledge power. And this summit, we have a combination of all of these. So the president is going to be there, which is a symbol of Nigeria's highest political power. You're going to have the richest black man in the world, which is a symbol of wealth, who is also a speaker from the private sector. And you also have a professor who I considered the leading economist on the African continent. He is currently at Princeton, Professor Leonard Wachakon. So he would also be there as one of the speakers. So you have the combination of these essential elements that would that are very, very key to driving a nation forward. And one of the things too to expect is discussions centering on soul-searching questions. There is roughly 2 years into the two major reforms, the subsidy removal and the flooding of Naira. So you're going to be asking yourselves, be discussing about it. Has this really worked? Should we give it more time? And so on and so forth. So it's going to be a very fact-filled and very engaging conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dappel. And from what you said, it sounds like no one should miss the summit coming up from the 6th to the 8th of October. You can join virtually or you can join in person. And so right now, we're just going to go straight into the questions. And I'm going to be going to you, Dr. Shadare. I initially had the question around how we balance economic reforms with social reforms. So things like equity, inclusion, poverty reduction. But to even buttress my point to how I was thinking about it, somebody else in the audience was thinking about it as well, because Wilson from YouTube asked, given your extensive work on social policy, how can Nigeria bridge the social divide and lift millions out of poverty? Any specific policies for this? And so I think that we can take these two together. How do we strike the balance? And then how do we then connect and make sure that we're lifting people out of poverty, given your extensive work in social policy?
Okay, so thank you to the people that have asked the question. That's a very interesting question, and I'm also reading a question here. I'll bring in the same, which basically is the same. So I think first and foremost, I think it's not just a question of how to balance them, rather than how to integrate them. So we have policies, in different areas, or on the policy landscape, different policies that just need to be woven into a seamless, coherent national strategy. I talked about having reframing the energy, the power reform into an industrial employment policy. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So we can have a more nuanced understanding of how we can actually tackle some of those policies. So I think that will also tie into what I think it should be our objective. Our objective should be moving from growth to broad-based prosperity. And if we want to achieve prosperity, we cannot, ignore the importance of social justice, the importance of social equity, and the importance of social investment, which is also social safety nets. I mean, if you look at examples in many other comparative examples in the global south and maybe even in Europe, you find out that at any time that government is trying to alter or fundamentally restructure the economy, they will always have a social safety net budget. And I think the problem we've had in Nigeria over the past few years is that we've fetishized, GDP growth, and because we are always confused and carried away by the inflated prices of the oil prices, for instance, and also carried away with all the razzmatazz, if you like, of being the biggest economy in Africa, but not actually paying attention to the poverty, multidimensional poverty that is actually affecting a majority of our populace. There was a time around 2018, Nigeria was actually dubbed the poverty capital of the world, despite the strides we made in certain sector, in the fintech, in services. Our fintech has done well. So what do we need to do? I think we need to, like somebody's talked about sequencing. I think sequencing is good, making sure that all the programs are well sequenced, and then you can ensure continuity, because we've had lack of political will. We've had ad hoc and duplications of programs that are overlap and actually doing the same thing. Dr. Dape talked about the Shopee, for instance. I think Shopee, and funny enough, we did some research on Shopee. Shopee actually did succeed. And I think the greatest tragedy was the discontinuation. It was not really discontinued, okay? It was repackaged. And in repackaging it, the momentum that should have allowed the incoming government to carry on was lost. And that was a great disservice to a lot of Nigerians. So Shopee was rebranded under Buhari as the social investment. But of course, there were so many things that they could have, so many lessons that they could have carried forward with Shopee in the conditional cash transfers. And some of the examples that we gave, for instance, some of the examples that we gave or proposed to government at some point, because we had a consultative committee and we offered some prescriptions and policy prescriptions, government recommendations. They were not implemented. Shopee, for instance, could have been the linchpin for the National Safety Net program, because if you remember, under Jonathan and the administration, they had an office of was it under Jonathan, under Buhari? They created an office of special advisor to the for social protection, which later became the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs. That's a good move. Because we've never had a Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs and Disaster Management and Social something. Such a long name. I think they should even break it down, because it's in the, so we've never had that. So we can continue on that. But to do that, we need to create the architecture for it. And we started well, but like everything that we've tried to do, there are always false starts. So we've had false starts. So they tried to centralize the social register. Okay, the social register, and I don't know what they've done with that. Because if you really, really want to tackle poverty in Nigeria, it's very, very easy to address. You need to go to the core of the problem. How many do we even have, information or data? Do we have the accurate data on the number of people in Nigeria that are multidimensionally poor? Do we have data on that? And I think we do, because the National Bureau of Statistics actually started something, and they were working with the social register unit that was created by the National Cash Transfer Office. But we don't know what is happening at this point. So I think that if the current initiatives by the president needs to succeed. I mean, if they will succeed monumentally, they need to go back to that. They need to bring in, they need to basically revamp the social investment landscape, because that is how you get people because government have to actually come to the aid of a lot of people. And the component of the social Shopee that I liked, which worked, because I spoke to a lot of people when we were doing our research, was the one that had to do with upskilling, youth empowerment, training, all of those things. Some of the people that we interviewed in rural parts of Nigeria that were registered on the program, they were disappointed when they didn't hear any more from the government. One day they just went, reported for where they were asked to report, and they told them the program had closed. No communication, nothing at all. And many of them were being owed money because, if you are registered on that program, you will be given a lump sum that will allow you to set up a business. Many of them never got that. So that also that speaks to the corruptive, and the corruption reading, and nature of our politics. So I think that if we can really, I think to empower and to redefine or revamp our social policy landscape, I think we need to do a couple of things. Number one, create the architecture, hire good people and empower them, and allow them to have some degree of independence. You can have that. We've had examples during the reform on that passage, and where they had the Bureau of Public Enterprise, and they were the ones that actually oversaw and basically superintended the commercialization and privatization of Nigeria. We can do the same thing. So if we can have a strong institution that is focused, that is like the hub for really, codifying the different fragmented policies on social investment and bringing everything together, creating a national register, national social register that will help us to actually, identify these potential beneficiaries. I think that will be the starting point, because we have a national social protection policy that has not actually been implemented. That policy now needs to be revisited, and they need to rework that policy, because all those policies are good. The one we never had it previously. The one that was launched in 2019, I think, or 2021, is very good. You may need to change some things there, but if that can be brought in and align with all that I've said by creating that architecture, I think that we will do well on the social policy front. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much.
Because
I believe that you have, and I can tell that you are very passionate about this cause, and it's indeed a very good cause to be passionate about. So thank you so much for diving into the meat of the matter and explaining some of these things to us. I can hear very clearly that we might need to tweak our social protection policy a little bit, but some things in there actually do look out for the best interest of the people that are living in multidimensional poverty. And while we are taking small steps in the right direction, we need to start taking strides in the right direction towards ensuring that we are catering to everybody in our society, including the people that are living in multidimensional poverty. Sansani from YouTube also asks, what can you say has been the disconnect between the data of economic growth by successive governments and the realities of majority of Nigerians who are continually getting poorer? But I believe that within the course of this conversation, we've been able to answer that, especially when we spoke about the barriers and also the gap that exists between economics and social policy, like we already spoke about, Dr. Shadare. So I'm going to go to the next question. And I believe that this is addressed to Dr. Faith. It's from Nathaniel Shofarasin from YouTube, who says, how can the government integrate maintenance culture policy in our reforms? Developed countries have used this to sustain development, giving room to developing more. So it's basically asking about maintenance culture, and I believe that this is really apt in terms of industries like power and agro agro-processing, and institutionalization of a lot of these reforms and policies. So Dr. Faith, in 2 to 3 minutes, please, if you could just answer the question.
Of maintenance is not something that starts at the middle of reforms. It should start at the beginning of reforms. So if you know you're going to embark in infrastructural development, you're building roads, then there should be a maintenance culture that is inbuilt. This has to be enshrined within the reforms and established within the institution or agency that is driving and monitoring the reforms. Essentially, what we are saying is, when you say, I am going to build a particular network of roads, and this is how many kilometers it is, when you have done that, when you have established that, or even while you're building, then you should always go back to check what you have done. Is it still doing fine, or do you need to go back? And then it's also important to use durable products when you are trying to build infrastructure, because when they are durable, they will hardly go bad, and you have to do less concern about maintenance. So for example, if you look at the Lagos Bridge, it's been done in a long time, right? So they do maintenance once in a while. If the bridge was not good, it would have collapsed over time, essentially. So it means when you use durable products, then you're less concerned with maintenance. However, the maintenance must be inbuilt in the strategy or in the process when you start that project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faith. Very, very, very succinct answer, but also very punchy and powerful. Completely agreed with you. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to go to the next question. Let me brace you. There are quite a number of questions for you. And when you see a number of questions, that just means that the conversation has indeed been impactful and filled with a lot of information. Nathaniel from YouTube says that until the reforms are aligned between the central and subnational governments, the impact would never trickle down. How can we push this during the summit, since all of them will be there? Over to you, Dr. Dappel. So how do we align impacts between central, subnational, perhaps local government as well, so that impact would go across all the arms?
So to be very practical, right, there is this on the paper definition that local states are autonomous, but financially they are not. Every month they get allocation from the federation account. And from the same federation account, the local governments, they also get finances. Now, just think logically, Nigeria is made up of 36 states and FCT. If each governor performs very well, the entire country, it's going to be in good shape, because these are the units, subunits that make up the country. So one of the practical best thing you give is state governors. Most of them, they don't make the most of this federation account. More than half of Nigerian states, they receive over 70%, over 50 to 70% of their total revenues from federation account. So what I would suggest as a way of curtailing their wasteful use or corrupting use of public funds is state and local government salaried staff should be paid directly from the federation account. So if we're releasing allocation to a state at the end of the month, we should deduct the wage bill of that entire state and pay the staff in this state and in the local governments in these states directly. And how do you do that? You have like a biometric system where you capture every staff in each state and link it to a database. Now, whenever payment is made for what we are salaries or pensions or gratuity, you just go to the machine or thumbprint or transfer it to a bank account. And that's a massive relief. So part of the suffering that people are going through is that you have pensioners that have retired for donkeys of years and have not received their payments, not because the states do not have this money, but because the politicians in charge of these funds from Federation account are not giving them. They're using it to campaign, to buy votes, to reinforce their hold on power. So get this money direct to the people. You can see states 5, 6, 7, 8 months they are not paid. So you can do that and delink that process of them siphoning the monies. Or the states can say, okay, but we're supposed to be autonomous, but you get the money from Federation account. It's only Lagos and River states that have less than roughly 10% of their total revenue from the Federation account. They can decide to do what they can decide what to do with their own finances. But imagine you're a student and your dad is giving you money to school and you're mismanaging the money, you're not paying your fees. Your dad would sometimes go directly to pay the fees on your behalf to the school so that you will not be sent away from the school. So to me, that's one of the practical ways to deal with sporadic payments of salaries of staff at the local government, and that can go a long way in reducing the extent of suffering.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dappel. I think that you've covered that question spectacularly well. We have just 5 minutes and we have 3 more questions. So I'm going to address one question to one person, and I'm going to ask that you please answer in 1 minute, as briefly as possible, if it's possible. And so we have a question from Magdalene Ekwo from LinkedIn, who says that in the Buhari regime, he demanded the closure of the border and the sale of Nigeria's own product. What would you say made that policy or idea to die? And I can see that Dr. Faith is smiling, so I'm going to address that question to you. What do you think made that policy to die in Buhari's regime, where they closed off the border and insisted that we buy Nigeria-made products?
Okay. Thank you very much. So some of the things that should have been done when that reform or when that policy was enacted was we're supposed to develop our import substitution. So start producing products that you are importing, because you're not producing and you don't have enough supply and you shut the border. What happens is there'll be an increase in price. The price will just almost triple, if not quadruple. So essentially, the main reason why it died was because there was no import substitution. So the agro industry should have been incentivized to produce more, to support the domestic market. Then closing it wouldn't have been a problem. But when you don't do anything from inside and you've shut the borders, then there'll be problem. People will smuggle in and a lot of things will happen, and then you see price going up because these are staples. And so one reason why it died was because there was no import substitution. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Dr. Faith. I think this speaks to what you said earlier in terms of co-creation, institutionalization, communication, and ensuring that, we are sequencing some of these reforms that we are putting forward. So thank you so much. And then to you, Dr. Shadare, someone asked, can you quantify how Africa is impacted by the Russia-Ukraine war and the unrest in the Middle East? Do you think African leaders can do more in advocating for peace while also advancing our interests? I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but what do you think about this, sir?
Well, I think when we talk in terms of the impact of Russian-Ukraine war, there are many ways to look at it. It's not a straightforward answer. You have to understand, first of all, that the supply chains, the huge supply chains for cereals, which was one of the, Ukraine has controls about 30% of the world, cereals. and world grains. And so that has been impacted. And to the extent of, the extent to which that has affected Nigeria, African countries, I don't know. I cannot quantify because I don't have the data, but I'm sure there will be some kind of impact. The question is more of a political question. So before we can answer the political question, I also want to look at some geopolitical dimensions or likely geopolitical dimension of the question. I know, for instance, that before the war, Ukraine had a huge number of foreign students, even from Nigeria, from countries like Nigeria, many African countries. And the war not only disrupted their studies, but disrupted their livelihoods. And I personally know this because I have so many children of family, friends, or colleagues, classmates who were stuck in Ukraine and were trying to exit Ukraine when the war hit. Thankfully, many of them have found, they've settled in many European countries, but some of them have had their studies permanently disrupted. Had to do other things. So it has affected livelihoods. And the impact of that will not be seen or felt until after the war. So a quick resolution of the war will be the way forward. And I think that one of the ways that the African government it's difficult to get African government to speak with one voice on this. But one of the easiest way to get consensus on this issue is for African government through the African Union to try and align, hopefully, with the EU or the European agenda. Because I think now that they're putting some kind of soft pressure on Putin, that there could be a plan. How do I foresee a peace plan in a short term? I don't think so, because Putin, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to deal with the Putin question. Let me put it like that. So, but I think aligning, for African leaders and African countries, aligning their interests with the Western European interest will be more like it, because that will sort of put some pressure or compound the pressure that's already on Putin. Whether that will achieve or put an end to the war remains to be seen. So I wasn't explaining that question, but it's a good thing that some people are taking us, to the
Yeah. Keeping us on our toes, I think.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shadare. You've been able to navigate what is mostly a political question and allowed us to see a little bit of the economic and social policy side of it. So thank you very much for doing that question justice. And we're far spent for time. And so I'm just going to read a final comment. Someone says that this was a great chat. Thank you all for sharing your experience, knowledge, and time. And I think that this echoes the sentiment of every single person that has been listening, and myself as well. Thank you so much to the doctors on the call, Dr. Shadare, Dr. Faith, and Dr. Dappel. It's been a very engaging conversation, and I've learned a lot. I know we've all learned a lot, and I'm definitely looking forward to the NES Summit, the 31st NES Summit taking place between the 6th and the 8th of October, themed The Reform Imperative, Building a Prosperous and Inclusive Nigeria by 2030. So once again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining this call. Thank you to our esteemed panelists for taking us through this very important, insightful, and engaging dialogue. And see you at NES 31. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Bye-bye.